So there I was, Dr. Amelia Voss, stranded on Kepler 442b with nothing but a field kit, a malfunctioning distress beacon, and the creeping realization that the universe had a rather twisted sense of humor. You know that feeling when you're the only human on an alien planet and you're pretty sure you're about to become lunch? Yeah, that was me. And yes, before you ask, according to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. I had made some spectacularly poor life choices to end up here. The crash landing itself had been something of a comedy show, honestly. The Stellar Pathfinder, a research vessel that had cost more money than some small nations had in their GDP, had decided to have what I like to call a mechanical temper tantrum. One moment I was doing routine atmospheric scans from orbit, and the next moment I was plummeting toward the surface like a flaming meteorite with really bad navigation. The ship made these adorable little beeping sounds as it fell too, like it was laughing at me. I'm convinced it was. What made the whole situation even better was that the survey team had specifically cleared Kepler 442b as being free from large predatory species. Sure, there were some smaller creatures documented, but nothing dangerous. Nothing that would see a human as a particularly appetizing meal. Well, let me tell you something about survey reports and their creators. They're often written by optimistic idiots who spend 5 minutes looking at data and then assume they know everything about a planet. I should know. I used to be one of them. The landing site turned out to be in what I could only describe as a glorified swamp forest, complete with vegetation that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never heard of the concept of natural selection, but really loved excess. Everything was either too spiky, too squishy, or too aggressively purple. The air smelled like wet pennies and regret. My regret mostly. I'd managed to get the emergency shelter up and running, which meant I had a sealed dome about 10 meters across where I could breathe without feeling like I was inhaling the leftovers from a sentient digestive system. The water recycler was working, thank the ever-present cosmic coincidence. The food synthesizer, however, had decided that this was an excellent time to stop functioning, probably out of pure spite. The universe was really committed to making this experience as unpleasant as possible. By the third day, I'd stopped pretending that rescue was imminent. The distress beacon was emitting a signal, sure, but it was roughly equivalent to screaming into the void of space and expecting an answer. The nearest station was 3 months of travel away, if anyone was even looking, which they probably weren't. After all, the Stellar Pathfinder was just one of 100 ships out there doing survey work. Nobody even knew I'd crashed yet. I'd have to make a pretty spectacular explosion to get anyone's attention at this point. This was when I discovered the cubs. I was outside the shelter, which was probably stupid, documenting the local flora in hopes of finding something that might be vaguely edible when I heard this sound. It wasn't exactly a growl, and it wasn't exactly a purr. It was something in between, like the audio equivalent of someone clearing their throat while also asking a question. I turned around because apparently my survival instinct was taking a well-deserved vacation. And there they were, 2 of them. Roughly the size of earth tigers, though they were shaped more like a cross between a big cat and a reptile. They had scales that shimmered in shades of deep blue and silver, and their eyes were this unsettling shade of amber that seemed to actually glow. They had way too many teeth, which was exactly the sort of feature that said nice things like, "Hey, I eat meat for a living." Their ears were pointed and swiveled independently, like they were picking up thoughts directly from the cosmos. I did what any rational person would do when confronted with potential death. I froze. Not metaphorically froze. I mean, I literally stopped moving, stopped breathing, even stopped blinking. I'd read somewhere that predators respond to movement, so I just became one with the landscape. In reality, I became a statue of pure terror. The cubs stared at me. I stared at them. We had ourselves what you might call a Mexican standoff. Except nobody was Mexican, and everyone involved was having an existential crisis. Well, I was having one. The cubs seemed oddly curious, tilting their heads in that way animals do when they're trying to figure out if you're food or just an elaborate practical joke. One of them took a step forward. I made a mental note of which body part I could afford to lose first if things went sideways. Probably an arm. You only needed one arm to regret all your choices, and I'd probably be doing that anyway. But the cub didn't attack. Instead, it did this thing where it kind of bounced on its front legs and let out this sound that was definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, a whine. A little pitiful, pathetic whine. The other one joined in, and suddenly I was standing face to face with what appeared to be the galaxy's most adorable death machines. And they were sad. I'm not a complete idiot. I knew this could be a hunting strategy. Lure in the prey with cute noises and puppy dog eyes, then bam, teeth and regret. But looking at them, seeing how their scales seemed to droop just like skin would, watching how their ears folded back against their heads, I made a decision that my survival instinct really should have vetoed, but apparently wasn't working at full capacity. "Hey there, you guys okay?" I said. Because talking to potentially lethal creatures like they were confused toddlers seemed perfectly reasonable at that moment. The closer one lifted its head, and both amber eyes focused on me like I'd just asked them to solve quantum physics, but in a nice way. The whine got louder. Now, I've worked with animals before. Not alien ones, sure, but the basics of animal communication are pretty universal across carbon-based life forms. These guys were communicating that they were thirsty, hungry, or both. And they seemed to have decided that I wasn't a threat, which was either the smartest or dumbest thing I'd ever seen an alien creature do. I made a decision right then that was going to change everything. I walked back into the shelter, slow and deliberate, keeping one eye on the cubs the whole time. They didn't follow immediately, which was nice because that meant I might make it inside without being tackled by enthusiastic reptilian murder machines. I grabbed my personal water bottle and a metal bowl I'd been using for analyzing soil samples. When I came back outside, the cubs were both sitting about 5 meters away from the shelter entrance, watching me with their heads tilted at nearly the same angle. The synchronized nature of it would have been hilarious if I hadn't been acutely aware that these animals could probably eviscerate me with minimal effort. I poured some water into the bowl and set it down carefully. Then I backed away, giving them space, and sat down about 3 meters away. I'd learned enough from watching documentaries on Earth to know that sudden movements were basically asking for trouble. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cubs just stared at the bowl like I'd offered them something that might be a trap or might be salvation, and they couldn't quite figure out which. The wind picked up a bit, carrying that weird wet penny smell that characterized the air on this planet. Somewhere in the distance, something that definitely shouldn't exist let out a sound that suggested it was either in tremendous pain or tremendous joy. I couldn't tell which. Then the bolder one of the two stepped forward. It moved with this undulating grace, almost like it was flowing rather than walking, which I suppose made sense given the reptilian aspects of its body. It got closer to the bowl, then closer still, and I held my breath because I was pretty sure the second I started moving again, I'd somehow trigger predator mode. The cub bent down. Its head dipped toward the water. And then, in a moment that I would replay in my head approximately 8 million times afterward, It began to drink. But here's the thing that made it so deeply weird and touching in equal measure. It didn't drink from the bowl. Well, not exactly. After taking a few laps of water from the bowl with its way too long tongue, it looked back at me, made this soft, questioning sound, and then padded directly toward me. I did not panic. That's a lie. I panicked internally and screamed silently like I was at the world's most terrifying concert, but externally, I remained perfectly still. The cub walked right up to me, close enough that I could see the individual scales along its snout. It was shimmering with this opalescent quality that seemed to shift colors, and up close I could see it was actually quite beautiful in that way. Dangerous things often are. Then it did something that I could never have predicted. It lifted one of its front limbs, placed it gently on my arm, and made this soft chirping sound. I looked down, and before I could process what was happening, I understood what it wanted. The other cub was already moving toward me, whining pitifully. "Oh," I said, because apparently I could speak. "Oh, I see." I raised my hands, and the first cub pressed its snout into my palm. Then it began to drink. The water, which I was still holding from when I'd poured it, was channeling over my hands and into its mouth. The sensation was absolutely bizarre. The snout was warm, surprisingly gentle, and the way it was drinking was almost reverential, like it was receiving communion or something equally important. The second cub didn't wait for an invitation. It slipped its head under my other arm, which was now free since the first cub had only occupied one of my hands, and started drinking from that side as well. I was now a mobile water fountain for two alien creatures that could absolutely destroy me if they wanted to. And I was just going along with it because the alternative was panic, and I'd already done quite enough of that today. "This is ridiculous," I said to nobody in particular, because apparently my response to intense situations was sarcasm. I've gone from scientist to human watering hole. This is definitely getting left out of the official report. Nobody would believe it anyway. The cubs kept drinking, and I kept standing there with my hands extended like some sort of mystical being offering sustenance. My arms started to get tired pretty quickly. Hydration of apparently large alien creatures is harder than you'd think. But they kept at it, and I kept standing there. And the seconds ticked by like the universe was taking a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of it all. Eventually, their drinking slowed, and they pulled away. The first cub made this satisfied sound that was definitely a purr, or the alien equivalent. A rumbling that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. It looked at me with its amber eyes, and I swear it was smiling. Cub smiling anyway, with all those too many teeth. The second one did a little bow, which was either a sign of respect or the most devastating thing I'd ever witnessed. I genuinely couldn't tell. Over the next few days, this became routine. The cubs showed up every morning and every evening, and I gave them water from my hands. They never tried to eat me. They never attacked. They just drank and purred and seemed to appreciate the fact that I existed. I started naming them Kai and Vex, partly because they needed names, and partly because I was slowly losing my mind out here, and naming things is apparently one of the steps. On the 5th day, Kai brought me something. I was in the middle of another thrilling session of watching the water recycler work when he dropped this slightly squishy dead thing at my feet. It was maybe the size of a small rabbit, covered in some kind of sticky fluid, and smelled like old tires and ambition that had given up. "Oh," I said, staring at the gift. "Thank you, I think. This is definitely weird, but I appreciate the effort." Vex chirped from where she was sitting, looking immensely pleased with herself. I realized with a mixture of amusement and deep existential confusion that the cubs had decided I was part of their social group. They were bringing me food. They were treating me like family. "This is insane," I said, picking up the creature with 2 fingers and holding it at maximum arm's length. "I'm being adopted by apex predators. My mother would be so proud. Actually, no, she'd be horrified. Let me revise that. I did what seemed reasonable. I cooked the thing in the shelter's thermal processor, which made my entire living space smell like the worst thing that had ever happened to dead animals. The cubs ate it like it was the finest delicacy ever created, which I suppose to them it was. I stuck with water and the leftover emergency rations, which tasted like what I imagine cardboard mixed with desperation would taste if you added artificial cherry flavoring. By the second week, Kai and Vex were basically living outside the shelter. They'd built themselves a kind of nest out of vegetation about 20 meters away, and they spent most of their time there when I was inside. When I came out, they'd appear from the undergrowth like they'd been waiting, which they probably had been. They'd whine until I came over with water, and then we'd have our weird ritual. I started to notice patterns. Kai always wanted more water than Vex, and he'd drink first. Vex was more cautious, more precise, almost delicate about the whole thing. Kai would splash around and get water all over my hands and forearms. Vex would take her time, making sure every drop was used efficiently. They had personalities. They had preferences. They were individuals. It was around day 18 when things changed again. I was outside collecting samples of the local vegetation because, despite being stranded on an alien planet with no rescue in sight, I was apparently still committed to the job. This is what happens when you're a scientist. Your brain just keeps doing scientist things even when your circumstances suggest you should probably focus on more immediate survival concerns. A sound made me look up from my work. It wasn't the soft chirping of Kai or Vex. This was deeper, heavier, and distinctly more threatening. The vegetation around me seemed to pause, which I didn't even know vegetation could do metaphorically, but there you go. A shadow fell across the clearing. I looked up, and standing at the edge of the forest was the largest creature I'd ever seen. It was definitely the same species as the cubs, but scaled up to roughly the size of an earth grizzly bear, maybe larger. Its scales were darker, a deep indigo, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and its eyes were the color of molten gold. I did what any rational person would do when confronted with what was clearly the mother, father, or caretaker of the cubs I'd been hanging out with. I stood very still and tried to remember if I'd paid my taxes and whether that mattered when an alien creature was deciding whether you were worth eating. The large creature took a step forward, then another. It was moving with the same undulating grace as the cubs. But somehow that made it more terrifying when it was attached to something that weighed approximately as much as a small car. Kai and Vex suddenly appeared from behind me, which was probably the scariest thing that had happened yet. I'd been so focused on the big one that I hadn't even noticed them approach. They bounded forward, making these excited chirping sounds, and did something that I can only describe as a full-body wiggle of joy. The large creature stopped, its golden eyes fixed on me, and I felt very much like I was being evaluated for something important, possibly something unpleasant. The way it was looking at me suggested it was having complex thoughts, and none of them seemed immediately lethal, which was something. Then it did something that made my entire understanding of what was happening shift like continental plates. It walked past the cubs, directly toward me, and lowered its massive head. I should have run. Every survival instinct that was still functioning on some level was screaming at me to get inside the shelter, seal the doors, and maybe consider an entirely new career path. Instead, I stood there like I was rooted to the spot, which, considering I was being approached by what was probably a giant alien apex predator, was probably not the best strategy. The creature stopped about a meter away from me. It lowered its head even further, bringing those golden eyes level with mine. I could feel the air moving as it breathed, carrying that wet penny smell mixed with something else. Something like ozone or copper. I opened my mouth to say something, probably something stupid like, "Please don't eat me," when it made this sound. It wasn't a growl or roar or anything threatening. It was a sound like thunder rolling across distant hills, deep and resonant, and somehow communicated that whatever was about to happen was important. Then it made a kind of clicking sound with its tongue. And suddenly I understood, without knowing how I understood. The cubs had shown it what I did. They told it about the water, about the ritual, about me. It was asking for water. I let out a laugh, which in retrospect was probably not the smartest sound to make in that situation. But I couldn't help it. The situation had transcended absurdity and entered into some new realm of cosmic comedy that didn't even have a name yet. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly steady for someone who was fairly sure he was about to witness the end of his own existence. "Sure. Why not? I'm a human watering hole now. That's my thing." I walked back toward the shelter, and the large creature didn't stop me. Kai and Vex bounded alongside it, and the three of them followed me inside, which meant my shelter now contained more teeth than most dental offices and substantially more chance of accidental evisceration. I grabbed every water container I had. The recycler had been working overtime since the cubs showed up, and I'd managed to stockpile a reasonable amount. I filled multiple bowls, set them on the ground, and then did something I still can't quite believe I did. I sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and held my hands out. I waited. The large creature approached me with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with its size. It lowered its head and drank from my hands, and I felt the weight of its trust like it was a physical thing. The cubs curled up around me, their scales warm against my legs. And I sat there in my emergency shelter, surrounded by three alien creatures that had absolutely no reason to be gentle with me, and yet were. "This is absolutely insane," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "I'm going to write this up, and they're going to have me medically evaluated. Nobody's going to believe this happened. I barely believe this is happening, and I'm living it." But it was happening. And over the next several weeks, it kept happening. The large creature, who I decided to call Aurora because of the way her scales seemed to shimmer like the northern lights, became a regular visitor. She'd bring the cubs, and sometimes other creatures would come with her. Smaller ones mostly, nothing approaching her size or the implied threat level. But enough that I realized I was becoming some kind of social hub in the local ecosystem. Apparently, word had gotten around that there was a human who gave out free water and didn't try to kill you. In the galactic economy of social currency, that was apparently worth something. The distress beacon eventually got a response. I got the message when I was out collecting more of the squishy dead things that the creatures insisted on giving me. The rescue team would be here in about 6 weeks. I had an estimated arrival time, coordinates, and a message asking me to confirm I was alive and relatively intact. I looked at Aurora, who was lying in the shade of a peculiar purple plant that I still hadn't identified. Kai and Vex were curled up against her, asleep. Somewhere in the distance, other creatures were making their various sounds, living their various lives, going about their existence on a world that had adopted me more successfully than any world should. I took a long time drafting my response. I confirmed I was alive and relatively intact. I reported that the cubs were fine, that the creatures on Kepler 442b were significantly less dangerous than originally believed. I mentioned that they seemed to respond well to water and demonstrated unusual social behaviors. What I didn't mention was that I'd been the only human on a planet for nearly a month. And somehow, instead of dying or being eaten or going completely insane, I'd made friends. Real friends. Not the kind that came from proximity or circumstance, but the kind that came from a moment of compassion and recognition that we were all just trying to survive. And sometimes that meant sharing water with creatures that would never understand that you were terrified of them. When the rescue team arrived, they made a big deal about my survival. They wanted to know about resource management and how I'd handled the psychological stress and whether there had been any threats. They asked about the creatures, and I told them the truth about the cubs needing water and my decision to help them. They thought I was making it up. They thought I was experiencing some kind of stress-induced hallucination. They wanted to document and study the creatures, probably with a lot less water and a lot more instruments and possibly weapons. I told them no. This shocked them. Apparently, scientists aren't supposed to say no to the opportunity to study undocumented alien life. But I'd made a choice out here in the swamp forests of Kepler 442b, and I was sticking with it. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going back to the station, I'm filing my report, and I'm going to recommend that Kepler 442b be designated as a protected zone. I'm going to suggest that while the creatures on this planet aren't immediately dangerous, they display signs of advanced social structures and should be left alone. And I'm going to keep what really happened to myself, because some things are too precious to share. Some moments are too important to be reduced to scientific data and research papers. Some memories are too sacred to be turned into footnotes in someone else's career advancement. I had sat in my emergency shelter with 3 alien creatures that could have killed me 1,000 different ways, and instead we'd shared something that might not have a name in any language, human or otherwise. We'd shared the simple act of one being recognizing the vulnerability of another and choosing to help anyway. Kai and Vex had drunk from my hands like it was the most normal thing in the world. Aurora had trusted me with her cubs and her presence and her attention. And I had learned that sometimes the most human thing you can do is exactly what a completely alien creature would appreciate. As I'm leaving the planet today, I can see them in the distance. Aurora and the cubs are watching from the forest edge. The rescue shuttle is warming up, ready to take me back to civilization, back to a world where this kind of thing doesn't happen and wouldn't be believed if it did. Kai and Vex are playing in the soil, wrestling with each other with the kind of enthusiasm that only young creatures can manage. Aurora is watching them and watching me, and I swear those golden eyes are sad. I smile at them. I hold up my hand. It's a gesture that won't mean anything to them, probably. But it might mean something. It might communicate that I'm grateful, that they mattered, that they changed something in me that will never fully change back. The shuttle doors are closing. In a few moments, I'll be gone. The memory of this place will slowly fade, and I'll go back to my regular life, which will be exactly as boring and predictable as it was before. But I'll never forget the day I learned that compassion is a universal language. That sometimes the thing that saves you isn't strength or intelligence or impressive survival skills. Sometimes it's just the simple act of offering water to creatures that are thirsty, and doing it Not because it makes sense, or because it advances your career, or because the rule book says you should. I did it because they needed it, and because something in me recognized that need and responded to it. And apparently that's the most human thing you can do. Even when you're on an alien planet surrounded by creatures with too many teeth, not enough reason to trust you. The shuttle rises into the atmosphere. Kepler 442b shrinks beneath me. The swamp forests blur into the purple and blue landscape that I'm leaving behind. And somewhere down there, Aurora and the cubs are watching the sky, probably wondering where that strange water-giving creature went. I wonder if they'll remember me. I wonder if, centuries from now, there will be stories among their species about the time a human came from the sky and offered water from her hands. I wonder if I'll become myth or legend, or just another animal that passed through their lives for a moment and then was gone. But here's what I know for certain. I'll remember them. I'll remember the warmth of their scales, the purring sound they made, the gentle way they drank from my hands. I'll remember that for one brief moment, I wasn't an isolated scientist struggling to survive on an alien world. I was part of something larger, something more meaningful than myself. And that's worth more than any discovery I could make or any paper I could publish. That's worth remembering forever. That's the real story of Kepler 442b. And now you know it too.